Compelling counterfeits in the age of deception. Everything that God has ordained, the world has a counterfeit version of. And often those counterfeit versions can seem more real than what God has. They can create the illusion of life, success, fulfillment of purpose. But the reality is, counterfeits have no life. They have no ability to produce success or help us fulfill purpose. But what they can do is they can, at best, distract. At worst, they can derail or lock us into a quagmire which creates the inability to actually fulfill many of the things that God has for us. And in this age of deception with social media, we have counterfeits of everything. Counterfeit identity, values, philosophies, even approaches to serving God. But today I just want to touch on briefly two very compelling, very powerful counterfeits for leaders. And these are actually two conversations that I had today with a couple of leaders around the world. And that is the counterfeit opportunity and counterfeit urgency. Counterfeit opportunity is that opportunity that presents itself that seems like it would align perfectly for God's vision for your leadership role, business, ministry, whatever it would be. That opportunity seems like it's both God, that it would facilitate your fulfillment of what God has for you, that it would actually give you momentum. It would literally accelerate you further on. And so it can be very enticing. But the challenge is counterfeit opportunity can lock you into that quagmire. It will rapidly unravel that illusion. As soon as you're committed, the illusion will dissipate. And now you're faced with the reality of how to deal with that, how to navigate from here. Now, let me be very clear. True opportunity from God almost invariably has a faith element requirement. But as a friend said today, it's about counting the cost, knowing when you go into that opportunity. First off, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. But recognizing that sober reality of what's the faith requirement that goes with that. Because if it's from God, it will almost invariably have a faith requirement on our part to see the fulfillment, to see it actually be all that God has for it to be. That it won't necessarily be easy, and that's why it's so good. Because that faith requirement takes the responsibility off of us and puts it on Him. But counterfeit opportunities, they look so perfect. But then again, as we're committed, so often that illusion evaporates and now we're locked in how to proceed. That again, often at best, it's a massive distraction. At worst, it can derail all that we're trying to accomplish, or it can lock us into this quagmire where we have so much inability to respond to the true opportunities that God has. So how do we respond? Well, first, it would be easy to just say that how do you respond to counterfeit opportunity? How do you know if it's counterfeit? And obviously, that is going to God. That's why we have the Holy Spirit, whose whole role in our life is not just to be our friend, our comforter, but to guide us into all truth. But that's an overly simple answer. So let me share it this way. When people come to me, when leaders come to me and they're evaluating an opportunity, first off, what is the faith requirement? If it's too good to be true, I'm assuming it probably is. If it looks like it is the only option, the only opportunity to fulfill what God has for you to do, it may not be from, in fact, probably isn't from Him. And the better the opportunity looks, the more likely I am to suggest, hey, let's look for things where God would say no, rather than look for confirmation that this is God. Because confirmation bias will cause us to read into things. Let's set out an agenda. Let's lay out for ourselves, these are the litmus tests that we know God is saying no. We're actually turning the tables the other way around. We're looking for opportunities to say no to the opportunity rather than to respond to it. And the other counterfeit is that sense of urgency. It can come from many different sources. Often, in fact, I'm thinking of, going back to counterfeit opportunity. Some friends in Romania a few years ago, my wife and I were over, they felt that urgency, they needed a building. And what seemed to be an opportunity was there, which didn't work out. And then amazingly, here we are several years later, we've gotten past so many challenges in the world, and their church is flourishing, and they have outgrown what that opportunity seemed like it would create for them. And it's the same thing with urgency. That another church over in England, they had this growth, they had this urgency where they felt like they needed a building. They were feeling this sense of frustration because their self-created sense of urgency meant that they were frustrated, they weren't feeling fulfillment. But in retrospect, we now see they will tell you to this day that delay wasn't a hindrance. It was in itself opportunity, that God's delay meant that we got through so many challenges that would have derailed them financially. And now then, they are not just flourishing, they're bursting at the seams. See, the challenge with counterfeits is they don't require our faith. And going back to urgency. So we have an urgency where, again, we look for every opportunity to say no. Which reminds me of the second conversation I had today with another friend who, very emotional, compelling, feels that sense of urgency. But before I said anything, he messaged me and says, I need to wait a moment. I need to see what God has to say before I commit myself. Opportunity and urgency can be natural reflexively the greatest challenge for leaders. That those are the counterfeits that we can so easily be sucked into, that we respond to, and in doing so, they actually slow down. They hinder our success. They hinder our acceleration. In the age of deception, there are counterfeits that are so compelling that they create the illusion of being what God would have for us. And as leaders, we need to increasingly recognize that it's our role and our responsibility to tap the brakes, so to speak, to look at what's the faith requirement and really take the time with God to determine, is this truly what He has for us? Or is this a counterfeit that's just going to wind up being a distraction?